Anytime you talk about military history or war, people's faces start to tighten a little bit. Margaret Atwood once wrote a great poem about the loneliness of the military historian, why people look at them suspect. You know, it's sort of like thinking that because the oncologist studies cancer, he loves cancerous tumors. Just because you study military history doesn't mean you like war. Some perhaps do, but you want to think of ways to prevent it, especially these days. But I'd like to talk about the role of democracy. And by democracy, I use that word very loosely in the sense of constitutional government, consensual government, the rule of law, everything from republicanism to radical democracy. There's so many different kinds. I don't mean just plebiscites, of course. And there's some general observations I'd like to make before we begin that are just sort of truisms. The first is that democracies, we know a lot about democracies at war. Why? Because history started as military history with Herodotus describing democratic Athens at war with the Persians. It continued with Thucydides about democratic Athens. And of the 1,500 city-states, perhaps 90% of them were constitutional, whether we call them oligarchies or democracies. So we know a lot about them. We know a lot about the Swiss cantons. We know a lot about Florentine and Venetian Italy. We know a lot about the French Revolution, the American experience. So we know a lot about democracies at war. Second truism is I can't think of too many democracies that emerge without violence. Or it's not the natural order of things to turn over governance to somebody, a commoner, to entrust the guidance of a state into what 51% of the people believe on any particular given day, in the case of ancient Athens. So it's quite rare. When the president said in Cairo that we don't support the notion of force to suggest political governance on other people, I thought, oh my God, we do all the time. Look at Nazi Germany. We wouldn't have got the democracy had we not defeated it and imposed democracy. Japan, Italy, ourselves came through violence. Ancient Athens, almost any democracy or constitutional framework in the world was a product of violence. So it's a very interesting topic. Third thing I remember about a democracy is at war, they fight all the time. In the 5th century, we know 2 or 3 very influential studies that ancient Athens was at war 3 out of 4 years between 500 and 400 BC. Venetian Italy in the 16th century fought about 5 out of 6 years. People wonder why are people in democracies so prone to war? Part of it is they're volatile. The instant expression of the citizenry can be translated into material action very quickly. There's a legitimacy that democracy gives to war. When a dictator or an authoritarian or a king takes a country to war, then he can be blamed for loss. But who do the people blame but themselves? So they're very volatile. They're quick to tire of war, but they're very quick to enter war. Herodotus had a great statement once when he talked about the Greek reaction to the call of arms from the Ionians. Remember in the Ionian revolt in the 490s, they wanted to break away from Darius. He said it was easier to get in front of 30,000 Athenians and get support than it was to go down and talk to some Spartan kings. The idea that the people could be roused and could be quite volatile. So besides government coming through violence, besides the fact we know a lot about it, besides the fact that they fight very well, there's a couple of other things. One is that they fight not only frequently, but very well. Someone going to say, well, Mr. Hansen, they lost the Peloponnesian War. They didn't lose the Peloponnesian War to Sparta. They lost the Peloponnesian War to Sparta, to Thebes, to Sicily, and what finally did them in, of course, the Athenians was they took on Persia in the last part of the war in the Aegean. But usually, as we see in the 20th century especially, they fight well. They fight often and they fight well. If you think about the American experience, is there anybody in the world we haven't fought? We've fought Mexicans, we've fought Spanish, we've fought British, Germans, Italians, Japanese, Arabs of all different sorts, everybody from Grenadians to Panamanians. We fight everybody, and with very few exceptions, we usually win. And that's been true of democracies throughout history. Another final initial observation, very controversial. Democracies and constitutional governments don't tend to fight each other as much. That's something to be hopeful for. I know that ancient Athens attacked Sicily in 415. That was a democratic state, and Thucydides commented on that. That was an anomaly. They had also fought, remember, In the later 4th century, Mantinea, which was a democracy, fought Athens. We kind of fudge once in a while in the War of 1812, where we say the Confederate Assembly wasn't democratic like the Northern Assembly, or the Boers, their parliament wasn't analogous to the British. But by and large, peoples who have constitutional frameworks and personal freedom, especially freedom of expression, are able to adduce enough arguments and get them to the people that they understand they have some kindred tie to fellow democracies. Why, throughout history, have these constitutional systems that we associate with the West, why have they done so well on a global scale? And here I want to be very promiscuous with the use of constitutionality, because sometimes we're talking about constitutional monarchs. It's not that whether they were democratic in the sense of Carmel, California, but whether they were democratic in the sense of the alternative at the time. So Cortez was not a Democrat, but if you look at the constitutional framework of 16th century Spain, it was quite sophisticated in comparison to what passed as theocratic rule among the people of Tenochtitlan in central Mexico. But it turns out that a lot of elements of democratic society, capitalism or the greater reliance on open markets, the respect for the rule of law, tolerance for different religious beliefs, a champion of individual freedom, what the Greeks, remember at Salamis, they wrote to the chant of Eleutheria, Eleutheria, Eleutheria. The notion that capitalism would give them more sophisticated goods and services and more plentiful. You could make the argument that at Veracruz, Cortez had more material goods than did Montezuma and Tenochtitlan. Once a free market was open and people could profit by coming and supplying the Spanish fleet. All of these things, and the idea of dissent, that in a free society you get different views that can be incorporated into the running of a war, all of these tend to, by and large, give Western constitutional systems and systems that are analogous to constitutionality over time and space some advantage. For example, we see Alexander the Great succeed in going to the Indus River and from a very small country of 50,000 square miles with less than 2 million people in a way that Darius and Xerxes, who had 30 million people at their disposal, could not conquer Greece. We see a small Italian peninsula spreading its influence by the 5th century AD over 70 million people. There are sophisticated regimes in China and the Mongols, of course, but by and large, Europe, the continent of Europe, is kept pristine, and Europeans and people who incorporate this classical system go all over the world, the New World, Africa, Asia. And by the 19th century, about 60% of the Earth's surface is in some way controlled by the British Empire. Now, it doesn't mean that westernized approaches to market economics or technology or rationalism or reason or personal freedom mean that they're always going to win, because actually the West is very small. The continent of Europe only represented in history about 8% of the world's population. Contrary to what Gerard Diamond said in Guns, Germans, and Steel, the natural resources of Europe are rather unimpressive compared to similar climates and landscapes in Asia and Africa and the New World. But what it does mean is that on any given day, no matter how far a Western army is from its base of supply, for example, the British Army in 1879 in Zululand will be better supplied with water and food than the Zulus will be by Zulu land. And the Zulus will be incapable of sailing up the Thames. Or the Crusades, which were always considered the nadir of European civilization, will be able to adopt a sophisticated form of logistics and transport, which I don't think the Muslims' armies were quite able to emulate and get up to the Thames in England. But it means that on any given day, no matter how far the logistics are stretched, or no matter how incompetent the Western commander is, after all, this is not talking about race, but culture. There's a Hannibal that comes along once in a lifetime, or a Geronimo. No matter how much they are outnumbered, no matter how difficult the landscape or unfamiliar it is to the Western Army, they usually have a fighting chance. Doesn't mean that there will not be an Islamanga, doesn't mean there won't be a little bighorn, it doesn't mean there won't be a Dien Bien Phu, but it does mean that all things getting equal, the Western system of capitalism, consensual government,
freedom of the individual, devotion to rationalism and secularism, the incorporation of dissent, will give a Western army advantages that its opponent has not had. Now, some of you are going to say, well, there were Mongols and there were brilliant Asian armies that had success against the West. And as we see in Vietnam and as we saw in Iraq, non-Western approaches can be successful. Now, why is that? How do you check this monstrosity of Western military dynamism? And I think across time and space we could come up with four things that the West has had trouble with at war, democracies, constitutional governments especially. One is this notion, I guess we should admit that first, the West is a construct. It's not necessarily monolithic. When we talk about the rise of Islam and how successful it was, say, in the 16th century under the Ottomans, we're talking about a unified Islamic power. At that time, the West is trisected among Orthodox Christians, Protestant Christians, and Catholics, and they're fighting and they hate each other more than they do the Muslims in some cases. It's not for nothing that the French fleet allows the Ottomans to winter at Toulon with the promise that they will attack the Papal States. As we saw in the lead up to Iraq, one of the great allies of the Arab cause was Mr. Villepin from France. He did more to damage American interests than any IED did. So there's always been a way that Western rivalries have played off one another, not to the point that they'd actually go to war, but some people have found national advantage and align themselves with non-Western forces. There's another thing I think is very important, and that is because we incorporate dissent and because Western constitutional systems are supposed to advance the values that they cherish at home and abroad, sometimes people have made the argument that the war is either optional, or it's amoral, or it does not advance national interest. Long before we ever heard of Michael Moore, we saw that the Athenians saw on the stage Aristophanes' Lysistrata, or Euripides' Trojan Women, damning the Athenian execution of the Melians, for example. Or they read some oratory in the Athenian assembly damning the expedition to Sicily. Or they read from Sallust or Livy or Tacitus, they made it a desert and called it a peace. Or Bishop Sapulgun, who went to Tenochtitlan, made the argument that Cortez was satanic in the way that he treated indigenous people. Or the Colenso family of South Africa were fierce critics of Victorian Britain in the way they treated the Zulus. And we saw that most prominently during the Vietnamese period. So if a Western army can be questioned, that its aims or its means are not justifiable, then somebody can harness it or call off its propensity to wage successful war. It was General Giap that said that the best weapon that the North Vietnamese had was the American anti-war movement. He didn't mean whether he agreed with it or not, it was just an empirical statement. That's a second way, besides fractionalism among Western powers themselves. There's another, I guess I would call it parasitism. Yes, when you incorporate as a society a devotion for rationalism, and you say that society is free to express itself, and you have people like Galileo or Edison that are free to pursue invention and discovery, you're going to have superior weaponry. But it doesn't mean that the enemy in a capitalist system won't be sold that weapon. The Roman Empire had prohibitions about exporting Roman mail to so-called barbarians. The cannons that took down Constantinople in 1453 were manufactured in Germany. There's a great scene in Bernal Diaz's History of the Conquest of Mexico of Aztecs being instructed by Spanish captives before they were being executed and have their hearts torn out. They're forced to show them how to use crossbows that had just been captured. Every component of an IED that blows up Americans in Iraq cannot be fabricated by Al-Qaeda. They have no expertise to make sophisticated plastic explosives themselves. They have no expertise to make sophisticated electronic timers. They do have the ability to download those instructions and find those things sold to them on the open market via the internet as military parasites, if you will. Now, some of you are going to say, well, we're always going to be one step ahead of them. Absolutely. You're always going to be able to jam IEDs, you're going to be able to make rhinos, you're going to be able to make MRAP armored vehicles, up-armored Humvees. Military success or failure, remember, always hinges on that cycle of challenge, response, armor versus the bullet. And because the West is the system that creates the weaponry, it's always one cycle ahead, except other less successful technological cultures can import that technology and it can be good enough. And if it's good enough, it can impart enough damage to call off the Western military machine. And that brings us to our fourth element that's successful curtailing Western advantage, and that's what I would call asymmetry. I don't want to dwell on Cortez, but some of the things that went on in the Noche Triste are beyond comprehension. Whatever you think about the murderous Pedro Alvarado, that a man 5'4" could kill over 60, 70 Aztec warriors and not himself die is amazing. But the point is that on that Noche Triste, 600 people died. And they probably killed anywhere from 10 to 15,000 Mexican. But it didn't matter. The fact that 600 pretty much hidalgos, well-landed, middle class, if I could use that term, upper middle class, Spanish, semi-aristocrats died was considered absolutely a blow that Cortez almost did not recover from. We have lost 4,000 dead in Iraq, and that has been a national wound in the sense that the United States almost called off that war. It didn't matter. It didn't matter that we can cite wars in our own past. We lost about the same number in the Marianas Campaign. Nobody even knows what the Marianas Campaign it is. We lost 12,000 dead during Okinawa, but at this time, at this place, and it's somewhat typical of Western history in general, losses matter more to Western societies. Why? Because life is better to live, and therefore more dear to give up. Think about that for a minute. So we get Jim Smith from Omaha, Nebraska. He's a graduate of West Point. Let's say he's a major, he's an Apache helicopter, he's hoovering over Basra. And Ahmed, one of 11 children, takes out a rusty RPG. Probably it's not worth in the open market more than $300. And he gets lucky and shoots up that helicopter. And what falls down on him? An American with $250,000 in investment in education, who's emailing his 3 children every night from Iraq, who has a 2,500 square foot home, and he falls down and crushes Ahmed. According to the calculus of war, 1 dead, 1 dead. Defenders usually do pretty well, so is it a wash? No, because when the American major falls on Ahmed is in a society of poverty where people typically die quite commonly. Islam, as it's practiced in Iraq in certain areas, has a different idea than secularism or Christianity, perhaps in America, about losses in war and what the proper sacrifice should be to further a particular goal. And pretty soon we have too many majors doing that, and the United States says, wait a minute, this guy was from a suburb, we had the best blue chip education, that was $1.5 million Apache that was lost. We are using $150,000 Hellfire missiles. Even the M16 and the helicopter that melted cost $1,500, and he did it for what? One of 11 children with a rusty RPG. That's not a symmetrical loss, and it's not new. As I said earlier, when the Hidalgo went down, that was a grievous loss in the way that a Mexican soldier. We're not talking about morality or our souls, because one life is one life, period. We're talking about the perceptions of loss. Same thing was true in Vietnam. Same thing was true in the Pacific. Same thing was true in 53 BC when Crassus went into Carrhae, was butchered by the Parthians. Westernism has a contradiction. When you combine capitalism and democracy or constitutional government, you create freedom and leisure. And that makes life good, which makes it harder to lose that life when you're fighting people to whom they don't have that same appreciation of the finer points of life. And that's been a problem in antiquity, it's been a problem in the Middle Ages, it's particularly a problem today in modern democratic society. Modern democratic society has created a philosophy in which if we are not perfect, we are not good. We put such demands on our society because life is so good and we want it to be in perpetuity, that the idea that somebody would lose it for something as ghastly as the democratic abstraction in a place like Fallujah is just almost incredible. Why would anybody give up a night like this to go over and drink Red Bull and go out and patrol and be blown up by Ahmed for what? For something that's caricatured in a Michael Moore movie. And to be able to ask an increasing number of Americans to do that worldwide is going to be increasingly more difficult. That any do it at all is in some ways a testament to an officer corps south of the Mason-Dixon line and a fighting person, an American tradition of mechanics and love of guns and adventure that's not common anymore in most of the industrial world. There's a second thing that I think that we should all be somewhat worried about is that in this desire for utopianism, we are asymmetrical not in the perception of losses, but the perception, as I said, of perfection. Just ask yourself in the last round of violence between the West and the so-called other, and what really bothered us. Was it more dangerous? Was it more hostile for somebody to write a book about George Bush killing him, and one person did, Nicholas and Baker, called Checkpoint? It's a novel about how to kill George Bush. It was published right during the Iraqi War. Or Salman Rushdie. Who was in more danger? Well, of course, Salman Rushdie is, and yet the predominant culture suggested to us that we were much more intolerant of Islam than Islam was of us, or we were. So the opposite was absolutely true. That we in the West can write a book about killing our own president, but we object to the idea that Muslims would like to kill somebody for just suggesting that the prophet may not have been a prophet. I could repeat those examples. Is it more dangerous for a Westerner to make a film like Fitna, as Mr. Wilders did and almost was killed, or to make a film that was called The Assassination of the President that won the Toronto Film Prize about George Bush right during the Iraq War? Is it more dangerous if you're a cleric to say, I think that Christianity is awful, if you're a Muslim cleric and you're a mission, which some did right after 9/11, or if you're the Pope and to have a very obscure reference to a Byzantine treatise of biblical exegesis whose life was threatened, 2 Christian people were killed worldwide. I could do this about opera, I could do this about motion pictures, and what we're getting at is, again, that the sophistication and the affluence of the West also brings with it historically, whether we're talking about Petronius's Satyricon or juvenile satires, it's twins of sarcasm, nihilism, and skepticism, which make it asymmetrical in the way that we not only look at sacrifice across the battlefield, but we look at ourselves. We put demands on us that we would never put on the enemy, and we create in the result moral equivalents that our felonies, as we saw from the President's speech in Cairo, are equivalent to the others' felony. Our misdemeanors are equivalent to their felonies. We adopt the second idea of utopian pacifism, that we're going to be absolutely perfect and we're undeserving of the appropriation of good. And we have adopted the notion of multiculturalism, that all cultures, as the President said this, there would be no more preeminent culture, that all cultures are by nature equal. We've just suggested the last 30 minutes that if you look at the history of war, for example, some cultures are quite dynamic and some are less dynamic. If you look at science, it doesn't matter that the President said the Arab world, the Islamic world created movable type or printing press. They did not. It doesn't matter whether he said that they fueled the Renaissance Enlightenment. They did not. So they were not equal, whether we like that or not. It's a tragic statement to make, but it's far superior to a therapeutic lie. Where are we going with all this? And I would suggest that when democracies at war, they have all the advantages, technological, logistical, organizational. They have the lessons of history to teach them. They take advantage of all the advantages of democracy, dissent, various views, input, free expression, brilliant analysts arguing in journals that they can draw on. Almost all of the successful strategies that were incorporated by General Petraeus had been published and critiqued and republished, and he was able to draw on that. We all know that. But we also have a tradition of critics that have been very worried about the Western experience because it suggests that just perhaps the one missing element of success in war that democracies have to be very worried about is morale. After all, let me finish with this disturbing observation. Why is it that between, let's take an arbitrary date, about 355 and 338, the Athenians in the 4th century BC, who have a larger fleet than they did when they fought at Salamis, they can't stop a thug like Philip of Macedon with 30,000 pikemen, and yet they could stop 250,000 people, Persians under Xerxes. They both came from the north. They were both invaders. They were both warned about them. What was so great about 30,000 Macedonians that was not so great about 250,000 Persians? I don't know that answer, but I think it has something. By the way, the Persians, as we know, fought only 17 city-states that are on the Serpent Call. That alliance was no larger than the coalition of the willing who died at Chaeronea. What the answer? There must not have been the difference between the Persians and the Macedonians. It must have had something to do with the Athenians. And if you were to look at the Corpus of Attica orators, which are a prime example of 4th century Athenian mentalities, of Theban mentalities, Spartan mentalities, as they're reflected in the works of Demosthenes or Aeschines or Lysias, Hyperides, you start to see that this is a different mindset, a different culture, a different attitude than what you read in Herodotus, Thucydides, and Sophocles. And why is it that from 219 to 216, Republican Rome, which is only 4 million people and only about a third of the Italian peninsula, an extraordinary level of mobilization I don't think that has ever been matched, except for perhaps the German army by late 1944 and the Israeli army in 1973, has mobilized about 60% of the population in a series of battles starting with Trebia, Trichinus, Trasimene, and ending, of course, with 600 legionnaires killed every minute in a 3-hour debacle at Cannae. Polybius may be right that 80,000 were killed. You can easily come up with a figure of about 200,000 dead legionnaires in an army that was 250,000. There's never been that level of casualties. And so what? Italy should have ceased to exist at 216 BC, Republican Italy gone, that's it? No. In the space of 3 years, the legions are back up to 250,000, and they go on not only to defeat Hannibal, but to rout him, and Scipio Africanus obliterates the forces of Hannibal at Zama in 202. How'd they do it? Well, let's fast forward and continue that analogy with the Greeks, and we'll go to the 5th century AD. And this time, Italy is not 1/4 of the peninsula, 1/3 of the peninsula. It's not 4 million. As I said, it's 70 million within a million square miles. And so they're confronted with whom? Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Lombards, so-called Huns. These people were a mockery of forces compared to the sophisticated military science brought to the battlefield by Hannibal. What is it about Rome that can't deal with that incursion across the Danube and Rhine? Well, the answer, I think, whatever it is the same answer that Demosthenes was trying to strive for. Why can't we do what our great-grandfathers did at Salamis? Our great-grandfathers who were fighting an enemy much, much more sophisticated and dangerous at a time when they had much, much fewer resources. And we're talking in the United States now that was paralyzed by a war in Iraq, whatever your feelings were. This is a country that just 60 years ago, at the eve of the war, they had a national debate over whether they could afford another aircraft carrier. A little tiny 20,000-ton Wasp. They had the Hornet, the Wasp, the Lexington, Saratoga, Enterprise. They thought 5 carriers will break the United States. And what did they do by 1944? They built 16 of them, all about 3 times larger than the Hornet in 1 year. So you start to see that military excellence and democracy has a lot to do with what one thinks one can do and what one thinks about their culture. So to finish tonight, and I'll be happy to answer any questions, it seems to me that why Demosthenes fails and why 5th century Roman emperors fail and why we may be failing is that in all of our cases, unlike the people at Cannae and unlike the people at Salamis and Plataea and unlike the people of World War II, one generation knows what it is to be a Roman, a Greek, or an American and thinks and doesn't worry about whether he's perfect. He just wants to be assured and thinks that he's better than the alternative. And another generation, far wealthier and far more affluent and with far greater prospects in life, doesn't know what it is to be an American and is not convinced that it's better than the alternative. And when that happens, anytime in history to a democracy, history says there's no guaranteed God-given right that you have a privilege to exist and sometimes you don't. I'll leave you with that happy note. Thank you.